Can everybody? Oh, yes, you can hear me. Okay, we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lina Cho. I'm an assistant professor in landscape architecture. And tonight it is my absolute pleasure and honor to introduce Shannon Mattern, the 2019 Myles H. Thaler Lecturer. Shannon is a professor of anthropology at the New School for Social Research in New York. And previously, in the past 20 years or so, she has taught at the School of Media Studies at the New School, at the Art Center College of Design, NYU, Rutgers, and UPenn. Her writing and teaching focus on archives, libraries, and other media spaces, as well as media infrastructures, spatial epistemologies, and mediated sensation and exhibition. She is the author of 3 books, all published by University of Minnesota Press. 1, The New Downtown Library, Designing with Communities. 2, Deep Mapping the Media City. And 3, Code and Clay, Data and Dirt, 5,000 Years of Urban Media, which won 2 awards, including the 2019 Dorothy Lee Award from the Media Ecology Association. In addition to writing dozens of articles and book chapters, Shannon collaborates on public design and interactive media projects and exhibitions, and writes a long-form column for Places Journal about urban data and mediated infrastructures. In her 2017 Places article entitled The Big Data of Ice, Rocks, Soils, and Sediments, she brings our attention to the archival practices of geo and climate sciences and the challenges of managing big data, the megadata, the earth, right? She asks, quote, who or what will unite the core repositories, marine sample collections, manuscript libraries, and digital archives? These institutions have more in common than their bigness. They're all fighting against instability, against material deterioration, shaky funding, evolving professional standards, and unpredictable threats like power outages and malfunctioning equipment. More to the point, she continues, they're all operating in a world of rising temperatures and sea levels. Geoarchives have always faced the reality of environmental change. Some contain chunks of icebergs that no longer exist, and water samples from lakes that have evaporated. Now, media-based archivists are starting to focus on resilience, too. A forming era Tenzi, a digital archivist, Shannon writes, we need to completely rethink how to integrate climate change adaptation into our existing work, from appraisal to processing to preservation, because simply collecting documentation of environmental instability is not enough. Shannon served as a public knowledge scholar at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and San Francisco Public Library, as a Möbius Fellow at the Finnish Cultural Institute, and also as a senior fellow at the International College for Research in Technology Culture and at the Bauhaus-Universität Weimar in Germany in Medienphilosophie. So tonight she will be presenting a lecture entitled Glimmer, Refracting Rock. Please help me in welcoming Shannon Mattern.
So thank you very much for coming. Thanks to Brad, who cannot be here tonight, for inviting me, to Lena for the lovely introduction, to some of my friends whom I haven't seen for, in Siva's case, 15 years, for coming tonight. And Lena mentioned also to Thaler. I should have asked earlier who Thaler is, but thanks to Thaler for endowing the lecture. So the article that Lena mentioned, The Big Data of Ice and Rocks, etc., is the precursor to the piece I'm going to share with you this evening. Actually, this article was invited by one of your sister colleges, the LA Plus Journal out of the University of Pennsylvania's Landscape School, asked me to do a follow-up to the former GeoArchives piece. So that's what this is. So I will begin. We're predisposed to perk up when we glimpse a glimmer in the Earth's crust. That shimmer might signal a quarter fallen from someone's pocket into the dirt, a watering hole on a desert horizon, gold or gemstones embedded in rock. We can even manufacture that geologic gleam by forming sidewalks from mica-infused concrete or by spreading quartz-inflected stones as ground cover. We've long sought to capture, to domesticate, to colonize that sparkle. If we were to walk into one of the many natural history museums that arose around the world in the 19th century, we'd likely encounter hundreds, if not thousands, of rocks and minerals, fastidiously arranged and labeled behind or beneath gleaming sheets of glass. The very best of glass in the largest possible sizes, the Smithsonian's George Brown Goode recommended. With such transparency, Britta Brenna explains, the objects could be locked up, safe from dirt, dust, and the touch of visitors, who could thus move around the museum without constant supervision. Glass also allowed for maximum illumination. If a ray of sun caught a facet of feldspar just right, it might wink at us. As museums later incorporated gas and electric lighting, curators sought to use these technologies to enhance their collection's visual appeal. Yet excessive light tended to damage materials, especially in art and ethnographic collections. And not all forms of artificial illumination were capable of capturing the full chromatic range of the objects on display. For instance, spectrally limited fluorescent lights installed in some exhibition halls as early as the 1930s tended to turn mineral aquamarine green and to extinguish the star and star sapphires. The trend in the 1960s, at least for art museums, was to transform the gallery into a dark, mysterious cavern pierced by dramatic pin spotlights. Chicago's Field Museum seemed to sustain the trend through the mid-1980s. In its renovated Granger Hall of Gems, slender beams of light from seemingly invisible sources reflected from jewel facets with laser-like intensity. Some gemstones rotated permanently on miniature carousels. The entire effect was dazzling, end quote. With a bit of geologic stage design, these gems appeared to glow or sparkle with inner light. Today, a curator might choose to use spotlighting, backlighting, neon, fiber optic lighting, or LEDs. Anthropologist Corinne Katz explains that exhibition lighting serves a range of functions. Within the galleries, it defines paths and pacing, delineates zones, directs attention, and creates atmosphere. And when directed at exhibited objects, it focuses our gaze, highlights particular features and material properties, amplifies contrasts, and cultivates ambiance or style. In so doing, light serves a rhetorical purpose, making arguments or telling stories about the objects in its rays, or even inventing characters for them. Light's quantity, intensity, color, distribution, form, and movement serve as rhetorical tools. White and natural light, for instance, tend to connote truth, realism, authenticity, and authority. Concentrated boutique lighting, which appears to emerge from within the object, animates what it illuminates. A well-lit stone becomes vibrant matter. Light thus serves ontological and epistemological functions too. It transforms rocks and minerals into knowledge objects, objects about which we can sense and know certain things, and, as we'll soon discover, objects that themselves know a great deal about us and our universe. As Roger Calwa, himself an aggregate of many disciplinary ways of knowing, acknowledges, rocks date from the beginnings of the planet and perhaps emerged from another star. Stones are cosmological and ontological repositories, and perhaps they refract a vision for the future, too. So in what follows, I'll propose that we can use clinical and experimental methods of illumination, particularly those that extend beyond our conventional humanly range of vision, to see stones as proxies for grappling with our long, craggy history of planetary disruption, and as mediators for our engagement with one another. We've already examined museological lighting. We'll now turn our attention to three additional qualities or applications of light, or methods of illumination. First, the polarized light of the laboratory. Second, the shine of gemstones extracted for the purposes of amassing power and profit. And third, blacklighting, a means of refracting the colonial and ecological histories of these other modes of collection. So we're on to the first section on polarization. So even stones dull and mundane, those specimens Calwa describes as arousing for no interest the archaeologist, artist, or collector, or diamond merchant, those that are neither useful nor famous, those that do not sparkle in any ring, even these yield their secrets through illumination. With his own stone collection, some of which he cut into cross-sections and thin slices, illuminated and photographed, Calwa looked not for purity, brilliance, color, and structural rigor, qualities a connoisseur would seek across all specimens of a type. Instead, he sought the singularity of each object, the curious alterations brought about by the stone itself by means of metallic or other deposits, or changes in shape due to erosion or serendipitous breakage. Cauat, who fraternized with the surrealists and studied with the anthropologist Marcel Mauss, found various likenesses to landscapes in his rock sections, just as one finds forms in the clouds. He discerned in one particular slice of limestone the approximation of a human face, and he meditated upon its furtive, shimmering lights and shades, and on the interplay of parallels and obliques. Archaeologist Christopher Tilley, anthropologist Penny Harvey, Tim Ingold, and Hugh Raffles, and medievalist Geoffrey Jerome Cohen likewise examined the idiosyncratic dynamic qualities of rocks, how their stoniness varies in relation to their wetness or dryness, their position in light and shade. Meanwhile, landscape architect Elise Hunchuk studies how stones mark boundaries and tell geologic histories. Geologists who study rocks, petrologists, also use light to extract information from geologic specimens. A 30 micrometer slice of rock, a thin section, not unlike those slices Cauat used in his collection, could be mounted on a glass slide and placed under a petrographic microscope. When the rock is positioned between the machine's two polarizing filters, light is transmitted through it, revealing particular properties like crystal systems, cleavages, and color that help to identify the rock's component minerals. Birefringence, for instance, refers to the property of a material to split a ray of light transmitted through it. Olivine has high birefringence, so its mineral grains, seen through the microscope, are highly colorful, while quartz, with its low birefringence, is mostly gray. Formed through the crystallization of magma, zircons are particularly durable and thus useful for dating rocks. As a rock weathers various geologic traumas, rings of zircon grow around the grain at its core. Like a tiny capsule, Edmund Matthes explains, the zircon records these events, each one of which may last hundreds of millions of years. End quote. The geologist will make thin sections of a zircon grain, put them under the microscope, and look at light reflected off the grains, light transmitted through them, and cathodoluminescent light resulting from hitting the zircon with an electron beam. The information yielded here informs how the zircons will be analyzed using other methods and instruments. Sometimes the light source is intrinsic. Some mineral grains have the ability to absorb and store energy from environmental and cosmic radiation. When these luminescent grains are stimulated, they release their stored energy in the form of light, and this light offers clues to the specimen's geologic history. One luminescent dating method, optically stimulated luminescence, measures the amount of radioactivity minerals have accumulated since the time they were buried. And please don't ask me questions about bioluminescence or refracted light, because this is about all I know about it, what I just shared with you right here. So, in the lab, light transmitted through, reflected off of, and emanating from materials serves as a means to date them, classify them, to piece together their biographies. Just as the light cast onto the museum's display cases transformed their encoded specimens into text to be read by museum visitors. Here, these optical laboratory methods permit geoscientists to extract data from their subjects. As the instructors of an Introduction to Petrology class tell their students, rocks are the history books of the planet. Meteorite impacts, collisions and rifting of ancient continents, erosion of long-vanished ranges, ice ages, and life itself have all left records in these books. We just have to learn how to crack their complex code. Which leads us to our next section on shine. It's quite a cryptographic conundrum. Cauat was taken by those stones that defied decryption and classification. Art historian Donna Roberts describes how he delighted in casting light on stones' ambiguities, their seeming at once animate and inanimate, organic and inorganic, mineral and vegetal, useful and useless, the stuff of poetic reverie and cultural symbolism, as well as raw material. We are fascinated by stones, he claimed, because of their severity, their radiance, their impenetrability, and their intransigence. They will not do what you tell them to do. Cauat focused on those that mean nothing to architecture, sculpture, mosaic, jewelry. They shone for no one but themselves. His chosen rocks only attest, he said, to their own presence. But this is hardly true of any stone, especially not those in a museum vitrine or a laboratory. We illuminate and irradiate them in order to extract and collect and classify them, and they, in turn, reflect light back on us. Their luminescence Backlights are histories of colonialism, which, as countless historians have noted, constitute the bedrock of the natural sciences, cultures of collection, and the institutions we have created to study and store their spoils. Geographer Catherine Yusof argues that geologic classification enabled the transformation of territory into a readable map of resources and organized the apprehension of extraction and the designation of extractable territories. The motivation of colonialism was an extraction project, she says, and it then transformed those extracted materials into radiant cathedrals and state houses in the new colonial cities and opulent palaces and civic structures back at home. Even the gleam of today's mica-inflected landscaping stones, granite countertops, tombstones, and marble tiles is refracted through expansive geopolitics. More than half of the United States dimension stone, natural rock or stone that has been selected to cut to specific dimensions, is likely imported primarily from China, India, and Brazil, or it's harvested in the U.S. and processed abroad. Poor information about stone's supply chain and the labor conditions and environmental impacts along it make it very difficult to reckon with the costs and consequences of all that lithic gleam. We might think, too, about the oppressively visceral shine at many sites of extraction, where miners toil in unregulated pits under a relentless glare, struggling to discern the glimmer of gold or a gem through sun-blinded eyes. Eco-literacy scholar Rebecca Griggs tells of iridescent indices on the Australian landscape, portents for prospectors, lighting the way to a lode. This is a long quotation from her. Folklore has it that fossikers and small claims prospectors once believed that Pilbara's buried metals could be read upside down in the sky. They'd scan incoming storms for lightning nests, electrical clusters towed around the low-hanging cloud cover by the polarity of minerals below ground. Where lightning lingered or struck the ground repeatedly, a lode was thought to lie folded between sedimentary layers, end quote. In order to acknowledge the cultural and political economic histories of stone, rather than reading upside down, maybe we need to illuminate from below, to find the elemental sources of superficial shine, to light with the dark. Black feminist theorists, attuned to the politics of lightness or invisibility, offer us several productively unsettling and ultimately reparative ways of seeing. Art historian Krista Thomas, in her study of African diasporic aesthetic practice, focuses on the visual economy, that is, of shine, the prominence of mirrors and starbursts in street photographs, the glitz of dance hall, the radiant pageantry of proms, the bling of hip-hop videos. Rather than signaling superficial materialism, she proposes, these cultural codes and modes of illumination represent everyday aspirational practices of Black communities who make and do more with what they have, creating prestige through the resources at hand. What's radical and critical about these consumptive practices is that they disrupt notions of value by elevating shine, which emanates from the commodity object over the object itself. Perhaps rather than regarding shine as a superficial external effect of a more corporeally integral radiance, we need to learn to read shine itself as meaningful, and especially to particular communities that have historically been excluded from capitalist commodity networks, or have borne the injustices of capitalism's and colonialism's extractive demands. This rereading constitutes a new methodology, she says, one that's more attentive to the racialized and classed and gendered cultural politics of visuality. Thompson offers Bling as Black popular and scholarly approach that is attentive to diasporic people's intrinsic place within, estrangement from, and relationship to modern capitalism. And that brings us to the last section, Blacklight. How do we recalibrate our eyes to bring shine itself into relief, to transform Glimmer into a figure on a white supremacist and colonialist ground? Critical race scholar Denise Ferreira da Silva proposes that blacklight, or ultraviolet radiation, is what irradiates many dance floors and makes fluorescent rocks glow in the dark. This same light can turn opaque things into luminous ones. It then works through that which it makes shine and transforms its medium in the process. UV light, in working through the body, prompts it to produce vitamin D, and it's been used to treat skin conditions like psoriasis, eczema, and scleroderma, but can also cause sunburn and skin cancer, accelerating skin aging and damaged DNA. While UV is beyond the spectrum of human vision, it can harm the eyes by damaging the retina, burning the cornea, and causing cataracts and macular degeneration. What we can't see can hurt us and potentially exacerbate our blindness. This is an all too convenient metaphor for whiteness, colonialism, and other systems of oppression that undergirded the rise of the Natural History Museum and, as Yusuf notes, geology itself. That is, geology as the discipline. All these deleterious and carcinogenic properties of UV, Silva argues, ultimately serve to productively decompose, to break the code of our malignantly colonialist and racist systems of classification and valuation. Recalibrating our eyes for shine and blacklight, repositioning figure and ground, looking beyond our naturalized spectrum of vision, beyond the color line as Du Bois conceived it, requires accepting both the constructive and deconstructive, the comfortable and uncomfortable aspect of prying open sore eyes. It compels us to recognize that colonial and racial violence structure the very analytical tools we use to think about global capital, and that colonial violence remains active in the global present. Blacklight, a black feminist reading device, Silva says, focuses on the elusive, the unclear, the uncertain, perhaps not unlike Calwat's illumination of paradoxes of classification and ontological slippages. Even the geochemistry of fluorescence itself is somewhat of a mystery to petrologists. But there is more at stake for Silva, because she's not merely drawing playfully inadmissible similarities, as Calwat was, between rock sections and landscapes and human portraits. She's blacklighting colonialist legacies of classification wherein a black body is coded differently, lesser than a white one, where an enslaved or incarcerated black body extracts the bling that then adorns and enriches the white body. Silva's blacklight aims to work through the typical occlusion of racial and colonial violence, a craggy, opaque, long-buried rock that would really reflect rather than transmit those revelatory rays, and makes it fluoresce. Her blacklight prepares the ground, she says, for an imaging of the world and its existence in which reflection gives into the imagination. Perhaps that imaging requires that we look beyond the vitrines and microscopes, the specimen labels and thin sections, to the political context of geology and the settler colonial provenance of its objects. Combining Thompson's and Silva's methods, Nigerian-born Belgian-based artist Otobong Nkanga, in her In Pursuit of Bling installation performance, deconstructs the traditional vitrine to display mica and other materials that, as Silva says, glitter image colonial violence. On an assemblage of low-lying tables of variable heights, Nkanga arranges raw ore and mineral samples, examples of products and artifacts like cosmetics and ornaments that these minerals generate. She also offers diagrams of their crystalline structure and archival materials documenting their excavation. Nkanga explains that by examining what mica looks like in its chemical structure, looking at the component elements that are in it, thus adopting the optical methods of the lab, she said, I thought maybe it's interesting to put out all these ideas together within a structure connected by magnetic rods, which you can change the displays or, let's say, the molecular structure of the exhibition, adjusting each table to different exhibitions. The overhead lighting casts a gridded shadow on the floor, transforming the entire installation into a topographic terrain. At the center of each array is a tapestry. One features a gemstone, abstracted as a diagram with exaggeratedly denoted bling, all the little arrows pointing out of it. The stone floats atop a relief map that alludes to the geographic terrain from which the material is extracted, but which is labeled not with landforms, but with the mineral's chemical elements and compounds, from barium to zinc. The other tapestry features two bodies, a man and a woman, whose upper halves are replaced with tiered platforms that allude simultaneously to the lab table, the exhibition vitrine, and the landscape of extraction. These figures' tiered torsos and heads mirror the architecture of the installation itself, or perhaps they refract it, bringing all the molecular modeling, mining, and manufacturing to bear, both physically and metaphorically, on the bodies that perform the precarious labors of turning opaque things into luminous ones. And by situating those bodies within larger topologies and topographies, Nkanga traces the supply chain connecting spaces of shine to places of obscurity, and thereby, she says, illuminates that which must remain obscure for the fantasy of freedom and equality to remain intact. This deobfuscation ultimately allows for what she calls a reimagining of the world. What we might also see refracted in Nkanga's multiscalar diagram of bling is what Yusof describes as the imagination of 100 million Anthropocenes that adequately map the differentiated power geometries of geology and its uneven mobilization through different geosocial formations. By blacklighting the Anthropocene, that geological age distinguished by the dominance of human influence affected by mining and manufacturing, we painfully draw attention to the violence at its core. But we also open ourselves up to the validation and adoption of other, more liberatory, reparative ways of seeing and knowing, and ideally, more responsible ways of being. Heather Davis and Zoe Todd call also for the consideration of indigenous philosophies and processes of indigenous self-governance as a necessary political corrective, alongside the self-determination of other communities and societies violently impacted by all the political baggage of the Anthropocene. How might we refract indigenous, black, and feminist Anthropocenes, and 100 million more, through the rocks in our labs and landscapes and vitrines, through the ways we do science, shape the earth, and construct natural history? We have cast light upon rocks in order to crack their geochemical code, to read them as cosmological repositories, time capsules, history books, material missives from distant pasts, different stars. Yet rocks don't only record the past. If lit just right, their glow can illuminate a pathway toward the future. Culture geographer Catherine McKittrick reminds us that the natural sciences, life sciences, cultural history, and various forms of emotion and affect are knotted knowledge systems that can read our planetary futures outside market time. Rocks, amongst the most prosaic of objects, lend themselves to observation through these various lenses, largely because of their seeming simplicity and resilience. Perhaps they're the ideal prisms or lithic lanterns through which we can backlight an overdetermined past and shine forward into 100 million possible futures. And that's the end of the formal piece, but I just wanted to share a coda with you that is a material kind of integration of a lot of these different themes. So, when the original Mineral and Gem exhibition opened at New York's American Museum of Natural History in 1922, it was already among the largest and most valuable in the world. Curator Herbert P. Whitlock used tiny glass mounts that gave the jewels the appearance of floating in air, while still contained within glass vitrines. One of the collection's beryl gems, a deep violet-pink one, sourced from Madagascar, was called Morganite, after J. Pierpont Morgan, who gifted it to the museum. This was the Colonial Museum, whose scopic regime, to borrow a phrase from film theorist Laura Mulvey, blatantly fetishized the gems of its collection and bracketed the extractive colonialist regime through which they were acquired. When the hall was renovated in 1976, the new space was craggy and fractal. It had ramps and steps and pits and branching rooms. It was capaciously or copiously carpeted in true 70s fashion and simultaneously cavernous and claustrophobic. And unlike its predecessor, an antiquated hall filled with uninspired glass rows of cases overlooked by visitors, the new space adopted a different, more aesthetic and intimate mode of address. Vincent Manson, a consultant on the design, proclaimed, "We want minerals to come across not only as scientific documents, but as art objects, as objects of aesthetic value that anyone can look at and see beauties of the earth." You didn't even need to read the label. Instead, you were invited to touch, to hug these specimens, put your arms around them, fall in love with them. Touch afforded a different way of knowing. Knowledge here was embodied and intuitive, yet it still precluded an acknowledgement of the exploitative regimes through which these minerals have historically been harvested and classified. The hall's didactic text didn't say much about geochemistry or geophysics either. As the Village Voice Jaya Saxena reminisced, "I didn't know shit about where the gems were found or how they were made. All that mattered was that everything was color and shape, angles and light. Even the plexiglass that stood between you and the hands-off collection material," she recalls, "was scratched cloudy by rings and nails. It was the most emo place in the museum." I hope you catch that reference. Anyway, we can talk about it later if you don't know what emo is. Maybe the dark ambiance promoted contemplation, inviting us to think about rocks not scientifically, but empathetically. As Saxena says, it forced you to consider something that grows and changes and shines just like you do. And it reminds you that precious things sometimes come in dark, dull, unassuming packages, just like a star sapphire, which looks like any other rock until you chip away at it from the right angle. For the Paris Review's Sadie Stein, that dark, quickly dated fractal chamber with its musty carpets, buzzing halogen lights, and glowing rocks embodied a combination of glamour and dowdiness, anarchy and order. And now it's dark, as in closed. The hall was shuttered in 2017 to make way for an 11,000 square foot gleaming showcase named after Roberto Mignone, founder of an investment firm, of course, and director of a pharmaceutical company, double of course, and his wife Allison. These are the Morgans of a hedge fund LED opioid age, and they're besting Pierpont's modest Morganite with a sparkling 12-foot amethyst geode, among the largest in the world, which would be like a centripetal force at the center of the Crystal Garden, the main exhibition space. A museum press release notes that the new halls will feature several display walls, large-scale media projections, and other interactive features. Saxena fears that Ralph Applebaum Associates, if you don't know, they're one of the premier exhibition design firms in the world. She fears that their bright, minimalist white design, set to open in summer 2020, will too closely resemble an Apple store. Others have likened the renderings to a sterile mall display, too bright, too virtual, too experientially alienated from the textures and geologic origins of the collection's materials. Yet the museum expresses a desire to de-fetishize the collection, to highlight the geological and environmental conditions of their production, their relation to plate tectonics and the oxygenation of the atmosphere, for instance, and the means by which those objects are transformed into knowledge and cultural objects. The new exhibitions, they say, quote, will tell the fascinating story of how approximately 4,500 different types of minerals arose on our dynamic planet, how scientists classify them, and how humans have fashioned them into gems and used them throughout history for personal adornment, tools, and technology. A case will feature minerals of New York City, connecting visitors to the earth on which the museum stands, a terrain inhabited by other species and societies well before the Dutch arrived to level the land and build a grid of streets, and a fluorescence and phosphorescence gallery, a dark room vaguely reminiscent of the hall's predecessor, will blacklight more than human modes of perception and understanding. What's more, the museum explains that new scientific knowledge in mineralogy, likely made possible in part through some of the optical methods we discussed earlier in the lab section, has transformed the way scientists and curators understand their subject. There's new widespread understanding that much of the diversity of minerals on our dynamic planet is directly connected to the evolution of life. Thus, the hall's new exhibits will tell how the story of minerals is linked with their natural environment and biology on the one hand, and with culture and technology on the other. I'm curious to see how these lessons will be delivered. Actually, I have an inkling, but I am not allowed to say until the space opens. But I'm curious how they will be delivered through embodied experiences, through new sonic or haptic interfaces, through gleaming displays and blacklit screens, or by some other means. And what might it mean to embed minerals within their cultural contexts? Might this be an opportunity to illuminate the cultural politics of extraction and the colonial bedrock beneath both the museum, as an institution and as an architecture, and behind the natural sciences? What would it take to blacklight the whole epistemological apparatus, as Nakanga does? To make the vitrines and wall texts, the donor plaques and institutional history shine as brightly as a 12-foot amethyst geode. Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for questions or comments from anyone. If not, that's okay too. You want to talk about emo? It stands for emotive rock. It's been gone through many phases. Millennials do not understand the deep history of emo. I could go on that if you want to, but it started before, now I'm blanking. I'm blanking on the more recent bands' names, who kind of a lot of people ascribe kind of the more recent genealogy to, but it started in the 80s, 90s. Anyway, I don't know that we have to go into that, but it's an affect, it's an ambiance, and it's kind of the ambiance that you saw in the old version of the Rock Hall. I think we have a hand back here, yeah.
Hi. I'm so fascinated with the way that you talk about, or I think it was a quote that you pulled out about the kind of form and shape and kind of ambiguity here and there that rocks have, because I'm also a rock jock. And I'm wondering if you have looked into any of the methods by which the gems or rocks are shaped before, like between the extractive process and then their final placement in the museum, because it seems really fascinating the way that the facets are kind of shaped to provide certain experiences of the light or to silence others.
I did have a section on that, but because of word count and time, I had to cut that, and I honestly don't recall a lot of the research, but yes, there's another way that the number of facets produce kind of different kinds of gleam for different aesthetic properties, which can increase the value of certain objects. So there are, again, exhibitionary, monetary, and perhaps even different kind of scientific reasons for cutting rocks in different ways, all of which have different refractive consequences then. If anyone else knows more about this and would like to offer it into the room, I welcome you to do so. I think we have some hands up here.
I was fascinated with the inclusion of Kahinda Wiley, and I hadn't really thought about some of the paintings in relationship to bling. I thought about the individuals in the paintings, but not actually the chroma and the backgrounds of those. And I'm wondering if you've seen his sculpture in Times Square, which is going to be moved to Richmond in a couple weeks, and if the three-dimensional aspect of his sculpture carries some of the same associations as the paintings.
I definitely should do that before it's gone. I tend to avoid Times Square as much as possible, to be honest, so I haven't seen it in person, but you've reminded me that I need to go. But this is drawn from Krista Thompson's book on shine, where she's kind of recuperating shine, both as something that is represented in work, literature, painting, and as something that is actually manifested through the use of kind of luminescent paintings or different luminescent objects, as something that is not just superficial and cosmetic or capitalist, and kind of all these concepts of superficiality embody kind of shallowness and capitalism, but instead saying that for a culture that has been marginalized from capitalist modes of production, et cetera, or used in very exploitative ways, perhaps shine is something that we should invest with more seriousness. But you're right, it does happen in both kind of it's the content, it's also the physical manifestation, it's multiple levels in which shine can be kind of embodied here.
I feel a little guilty because I got to talk to you a lot earlier today.
That's okay.
But I was again thinking about Fred Wilson in this one piece called "The Unnatural Movement of Blackness," where he makes has a globe and traces the routes that slave ships took, and that also the routes of like oil rigs, like moving oil around the world. And then also these like deep sea like cables that like these like big rubber encased cables that go under the ocean to bring data around. And that piece is an art piece, sure, and it's in it's on display. And my question is like there's Glimmer is a way to bring in this didactic sort of like to make an exhibit maybe more didactic about exploitation and racial trauma. How would like that be how could an exhibit be designed to really acutely trace these and historicize the what we're seeing in the Apple Store version that we're getting now?
So how could we take that blindingly white exhibit and use that space designed with all those aesthetic qualities to call attention to supply chains and exploitation and...
Well, it seems like there's so much more to problematize about the way that these things are presented. Like, how would like what would like an architect or a designer or someone do to make bring that like perspective to a place.
I think that would be a great subject for a design studio in the future, to be honest. But, you know, there are lots of artists and filmmakers who are trying to make visible the invisible, colonial histories, infrastructure, supply chains, logistics. So there's a lot of work in this in the design and art fields right now. And I'm trying to think of landscape architects and architects who work with these concepts. Can anyone think of examples of folks who try to make these explicit or experiential in their work? Ghazal? Would you like to say something about your work?
Thank you. So first I want to start with a commentary and thank you regarding your presentation. I think one thing that's really striking here is the irony that is embedded in the museum space and the fact that by illuminating these objects on one hand, they're offering this kind of scientific narration of the geological history, but at the same time they're hiding the truth of the ground, as you mentioned, for instance, the history of the Dutch occupation of the Manhattan, for instance, right? So there, I personally think that design and design narrative and design research has a lot to offer when it comes to essentially bringing back those grounded histories to the surface and to be able to offer truth outside sort of the scientific agenda and the museum space. But what I'm interested in, and perhaps it's a question for you, it's a much more simpler play with light and a simpler question regarding how we may start reading data that can be observed on the ground outside the museum space, and whether there has been indigenous practices and local practices in absence of tools and technologies that are highly overlooked.
Mm-hmm. I'd say the answer is yes, there absolutely are, but what techniques can you use to make those visible? Is that what you're asking? How might we illuminate them?
Yes, or perhaps different ways of understanding what observation is in the first place.
Well, I think just the adoption of kind of embodied pedagogy practices. So rather than just looking at a chart or a data visualization, there are, again, artists and designers and different teachers who recognize that certain cultures are more performative, oral cultures, for instance. So finding ways that understandings of space are something that are captured in forms of media that don't typically fit easily, readily into our archives. So that is one method that these different populations have used. And again, I wish I could think of some more concrete examples. I know there are plenty of landscape architects and architects. Even I see a construction site on your campus. I'm not sure what direction it is from here, but looking at the history of black laborers, kind of making that labor visible that made your educational experiences possible. And there are lots of institutions of higher education, other cultural and political institutions who are grappling with those same histories and trying to find ways to make them visible. If that's sufficient, I doubt. But yeah, the issue of using metaphorical or literal illumination to acknowledge indigenous practices. Again, I wish I could have some concrete examples. It's something that archives and libraries are really grappling with as well, by shaping their classification systems, by thinking of incorporating other forms of knowledge that are just printed texts and traditional audiovisual formats. So expanding the purview of what can fit into an archive and all the different sensory modes through which knowledge is embodied and communicated. So that's one method. Yeah, it's something I want to think more about. And maybe you have some ideas also yourself.
I do not, but I'm very curious.
Maybe somebody else in here does. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I was involved in some long discussions in design review with David Adjei and Phil Freelon when they were developing the skin for the African American History and Culture Museum. And Teresita Fernandez, the New York sculptor, was also on this design review board with me, and she knew so much more about the performance of metal than any of the architects on the review board or on the design team. And she really pushed hard because she realized that that project would fail if it didn't glimmer. That all of the ways that they were trying to save money, because they didn't really have money for bronze, they had to do something else, were making the building look a little bit like a spec office building and not the most beautiful brown skin ever. And so I just bring that up because I do think that there are maybe not so much design processes, but ways that designers have been working with materials that open up other associations. And I hadn't thought about Teresita's prodding relative to other aspects of African American culture, but it seems to me that your lens today shows a different way to interpret that building, which is not only about references in Africa and baskets and metal work, but also contemporary Black culture. So I want to thank you. It made me start thinking about some buildings I know differently.
Thank you for that comment, too. That helps me think about what I was written differently also. Okay. I think that's good. Well, thank you very much.